Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in about a minute, just letting some as people just join us. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Let's get started. It's great to be here today. My name is Stephen Hanmer-Delia. And so today there's a Q&A where you can ask questions that we will, during our Q&A time, we will be answering those questions. But it's really wonderful to be here today. I have dedicated the past 25 years as a therapist, social worker, and policymaker to support children, young people, and parents impacted by violence and conflict around the world, including leading UNICEF's initiatives on religion. Today, we are joined by a fantastic team of experts to explore how child rights, parental rights, and family values intersect within religious communities and the broader public discourse in the United States. This conversation comes at a crucial moment. Before we begin, I'd like to frame our discussion, our conversation today with 4 key points. The first one, shared values. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, the most universally endorsed human rights treaty, resonates with core values held by various religious traditions. These include the inherent dignity of the child, the family as the primary environment to raise children, society's responsibility toward children, and a holistic understanding of children's physical, emotional, social, and spiritual needs. Second point, it is also important to recognize that some beliefs, attitudes, and practices within religious contexts may promote or justify violence and discrimination against children. Whether these are genuine religious doctrines or misinterpretations used to justify harmful practices, they severely compromise a child's well-being. Third point, religious communities themselves often express concerns about partnering with child rights organizations. For example, they fear co-optation within secular frameworks and worry that the language of rights might force them to compromise their core values. The final and crucial point for today's conversation is our commitment to open and meaningful dialogues on these challenging topics, emphasizing the importance of listening and understanding diverse perspectives. We should not shy away on speaking our individual truths. As my grandmother, who immigrated to Uruguay from Ukraine, used to say, speak with no hairs on your tongue, sin pelos en la lengua. We will not agree with each other on everything we talk about today, and that is okay. So let's get started. Let's start with our origin story. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and answer this, very simple question. If we assume children have rights, from where do these rights originate? So let me start with Aza.
Hello, Stephen, and warm greetings to all. I think the answer for me is really very simple. As a person who is of the Muslim faith, my understanding is that the Creator granted all the creation's rights. That, by the way, also includes nature, but that's another conversation. For now, I think it's important to understand that those rights are not delineated by age. They're not delineated by territory. They're not delineated by race or gender. They are rights that the Creator gave to his creation. And that is what I believe, and that's what my faith teaches me. Pre-Islamic Arabia had a very difficult habit to come to terms with, which is one where they basically buried the daughters, baby daughters. If they were born as female, they would bury them because there was a consideration that this is a burden, this is not a good thing. And the Holy Quran is absolutely clear in multiple places to say, this is not what you do. You do not do this. God will provide. The Creator will provide. If you're worried about not being able to look after them, the Creator will provide. And it is that Creator will provide that is the fundamental aspect also of our rights. We have rights that the Creator provides. That's what I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Aza. And Aza, in her very typical, unassuming, humble way, has not told us about herself. So can you give us, and I've been honored actually to know Aza for nearly 20 years, 15 years we've known each other, and an amazing human being and person, a trailblazer in terms of so many ways. So give us your story, Aza, like the brief, who is Aza? And yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words, Stephen. I'm just impressed that you still talk to me after 20 years and that you still like me. I think that in and of itself, thank you. I would like to see myself, and I understand myself to be a human rights activist and a scholar, and also someone who believes very, very strongly that that the interfaith existence is not about what is being practiced today, but it is really about what is being built by so many of these amazing people on the screen, which is the ability to come together as one, believing that we are one, that no one will survive without the other. That is my broad spectrum. I've worked internationally all my life, about 20 years only with the UN, but also in so many other spaces, interfaith, secular human rights. I now have the privilege of leading the first faith-inspired, but by no means faith-based, faith-inspired international management consultancy, which is called Lead Integrity, that being the mission, the purpose, and the aspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Aza. Jed, over to you.
Yeah, so just very briefly on myself, I serve with an organization called the Christian Alliance for Orphans, and it's a coalition of about 250 different organizations that are serving vulnerable children and families, both here across the US in the foster system and in other child welfare areas, as well as globally, all around the world. And so I love being a part of that work, and just, man, thrilled to be a part of this conversation. To me, it's just, this kind of embodies the best of people coming together saying, hey, we see some things differently and we can speak earnestly and openly about that, but we also care so deeply about so many of the same things. That's why we're gathered, right? And I love being able to hold those things together, which our society's having trouble doing that, but I think we need more of it. And then in terms of the question of, where are rights coming from? I think that's so important, Stephen, and I think it is so easy to leap over that because we're privileged to live in a society where the general consensus is, hey, children are precious, and not just the ones that quote unquote matter to us that share our genetic material, but that all children are intrinsically valuable, not just for what they can produce, not what they can do out on the farm or whatever it is they might be useful for, but they are intrinsically, inherently precious and valuable. And thus both those who belong to them have an obligation to protect and care for them, but then more broadly, we as a society also have a certain obligation there. And we assume that to be true. And it'd be very rare to find someone who would not believe that. But so we leap over the question, where do they come from? And I thought Aza expressed things well. I, coming from the Christian tradition, believe very much that these are indeed flowing from our Creator. And I think it's important to say that this was not, as Aza alluded to, this was not self-evident to many cultures throughout the world. We can assume that today because it seems so self-evident to us, but it is not intrinsically self-evident, at least was not to many, many cultures. The Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, they had very different views of this. And much as Aza described, ancient Romans had a way of getting rid of a child that was unwanted because maybe it was malformed, maybe it was a girl when a boy had been wanted, maybe it just arrived at an inconvenient time. It could be taken outside the city. It was perfectly acceptable to expose it, to just leave it outside the city for wind and rain and wild animals to finish it off. And that is, a picture of what an alternative vision is. And in many ways, I do think that if we were only to look at biology, and if we were to say that survival of the fittest is really our overarching governing principle of life, then really the only children that matter are those that carry our genetic material. That our only moral obligation is to them. But I believe that there is indeed a maker of all things, that all humans were made in his image. And so they possess this intrinsic value. And so that, of course, leads us into all the things that we'll be able to discuss together today.
Thank you so much, Jed. Rabbi Diana.
My mouse was being a little strange. Sorry about that. First, thank you for inviting me to this important conversation, and it is just such a tremendous joy to be here with my esteemed colleagues. Thank you for having me. So about myself, I work for the New York Board of Rabbis. I'm getting ready to start my 20th year here. 23 years as a rabbi, previously as a congregational rabbi, actually, working in very large institutions. First one was in Atlanta, Georgia at The Temple, which is known for its civil rights activism, and a congregation in Short Hills, New Jersey, Temple B'nai Jeshurun. For me, working with children has become, well, it's always been part of my soul. Having worked, however, as a congregational rabbi, you start to work with children in a different way because you see them from the time they are born. And I have officiated at the baby naming of a child. I've officiated their bar mitzvah. I've seen them come through their confirmation. I've seen them get married. I've seen them start their own families. And you start to see that cycle and that arc of life. Where does that come from? That comes from the divine. According to Judaism in Genesis, a shared text for so many of us, so God created humanity in God's image. In the image of God, God created them. God created all people, all human beings, and I believe all creatures that walk the earth. And human life is sacrosanct, and children are valued as really a divine trust, because they're considered to be the guarantors of the future. They're the future of community, and they're the future of family. Not just their genetic, biological family, but the family of families. The parental obligations and duties are so important because those children are entrusted to us. We have a shared responsibility. We have to. It's not just about, oh, well, I don't have a child in my home, so therefore I am not responsible for children's safety, happiness, health, education, all the things that I'm sure we're going to get to today. But in fact, as in a community of adults, it is our paramount responsibility to make sure that children have access to all of these things. Why? They are our future, and without them, we are nothing. So I am so grateful to be part of today's conversation, sharing a little bit of my tradition and learning more from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Diana. Over to you, Michael.
Yes, my thanks too for inviting me to this conversation with such a great group of people, and looking forward to learning a lot from all of you along the way. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO of UNICEF USA, which is a private not-for-profit organization that represents UNICEF in a variety of ways here in the United States. And I joined UNICEF 4 years ago after a 20-plus year career in global humanitarian and development work, both with faith-based organizations in the Christian tradition and also in secular organizations. And my call to UNICEF was really because of this focus on children, on the welfare, well-being of children. And there's no organization that does more for children all around the world. So it's a privilege to be a part of that work. To answer the question, I would maybe talk in 3 different parts. One, in terms of the origin of rights for children. The first one, just to echo what some of my colleagues here have already said, that I believe that comes from the Creator that endows all of humanity with those rights. Children are humans; they are people, not distinguishable really from the rest of us, and therefore the idea of human rights extends to children just as much as it does to any of the rest of us. So I think it's anchored in the general sense of human rights from the Creator. I think secondly, all of our faith traditions bring this forward in their own ways, and whether the followers of these faith traditions have done a good job recognizing that is a question we could debate at another time as well. But I look to my own tradition, Christian tradition. I look to Jesus's words and actions. At a moment when children were coming to him and the disciples were trying to shoo the children away, he said, "No, let them come." He wanted to be around children. He wanted to engage with them. He wanted to hear from them. He tells all of us that if we want to enter the kingdom, we have to enter like children. The value that he places on children and the views that children have and the way that they look at things, I think is really inspiring for all of us. And then maybe just third, in terms of origin, I do think there are important moments throughout time when the rights of children have been raised up and formalized. And we'll talk more about this along the way, but the Convention on the Rights of the Child is certainly one of those moments that put language to these things that we all agree and believe on in various ways. So lots of origin, I think, to the topic we're dealing with today.
Thank you, Michael. And Rebecca?
Thank you. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with colleagues and friends to discuss this important subject. And thank you for the hosts for bringing me on board. I've worn many hats during my career, so it's complicated to answer that without thinking of the different hats. On the one hand, I really echo and concur with everything that has been said about the origins. And we, in fact, at Arigato International, which is the only NGO that's faith-inspired that works exclusively for promoting all children's rights as per the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's a long introduction, but Arigato International does this now for several decades, using the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a guiding reference. Having said that, just to concur and to support what everybody is saying on this panel, I would like to show you, I like to do show and tell. This is our multi-religious study on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We introduced this in 2019. It took us, we did it as quickly as we could, bringing the major religions' perspectives on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. UNICEF was part of the process of endorsement, and they supported this. They also reviewed it. And we had quite a wide range of experts, both on the human rights side and also experts from diverse religions giving their opinion. And of course, Stephen, we used your earlier work at UNICEF that made some very important findings. So if we look at the origin, I have to agree, it's rooted in the major religious traditions. Having said that, I also have to say that for me as a lawyer, I'm trained as a lawyer, and I've been in the international human rights arena for many, many decades now, I have to say that for me, the origins also are rooted in the body of human rights work that has been especially developed within the United Nations, but also with the, if you look at the history in different countries that have been leaders in championing human rights. So I think it's both. For the secular world, I think the CRC and that body of human rights law is very, very important. For the spiritual, faith-based people that we are here, then I think it goes further back into the origins. And you have to look at this study. We have it in several languages, and it shows the shared values between the CRC and major religions. And this is important because that has been a big reason why there have been issues and controversy around the CRC in the United States in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And Rebecca didn't mention something really important, that she's also Uruguayan. So this is probably the first time in a long time that you have two Uruguayans. A country so small, we do quite well in soccer, given how small we are. But that is, I've never been with another Uruguayan in this case. There are very few of us in the world. I would be remiss when we're talking about origin story, not to really to put this within context. This culture of encounter conversation that we're having today is thanks to this joint initiative of the Berkeley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University. So I do want to mention that. So now let's go and talk about the different perspectives on child rights. And we will get to that part where we talk about tensions and other parts. But first, let's get a grounding. Let's set up a foundation, a basis from each of your respective perspectives. And I'm going to go to you, Rebecca. Rebecca, since the beginnings of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, when it was coming up and its ratification, was very, very involved in trying to get the United States to ratify the convention, which the United States has not ratified. And so let's start with you, Rebecca. Tell us a little bit about the history of the United States' opposition to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And let's start with you, Rebecca.
Well, this is a huge area, and I can't really do it justice in a couple of minutes, but just to say that when I was hired by UNICEF headquarters back in 1989, the Convention on the Rights of the Child was just about to be adopted by the UN General Assembly. It was a unanimous adoption of the convention in 1989. We at UNICEF were very involved in promoting that. I mean, I was, with my colleagues, we had teams that would talk to people in the Interparliamentary Union, and we would talk to, the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly where delegates were asking questions about the convention, et cetera, et cetera. So the US at that point was not being per se targeted because all countries were expected to ratify. And this is different from signing a convention. So I don't want to get into the legal technicalities, but very quickly, UNICEF headquarters got very much involved because UNICEF is named in the convention expressly. So we took that very seriously at UNICEF headquarters. The fact that UNICEF is mentioned expressly as being critical to the implementation of the convention. So we got very much involved in promoting the ratification process, and in a period of 5 years, I would say from 1990, from when it entered into force to 1995, virtually all countries were ratifying. So it came down to just a very few countries. And now the US is the only one in the world that has not ratified. And in 1995, just an interesting anecdote, we were really concerned about the US not ratifying, and we knew what the issues were. And we were doing a lot of advocacy on Capitol Hill. And there was a point where there were a lot of senators, because you need 2/3 of the Senate to be able to ratify a convention. There were a lot of senators on board. Something happened through politics, and I can go into the discussions, a lot of misinformation, a lot of misunderstanding about the intention of the convention, the principles and standards of the convention. All of that got very, very confused. And all you need is a little misinformation to get everybody very upset and not support a position. And I think it's very unfortunate, but Mr. Grant, the executive director of UNICEF in 1995, he was very ill and he was at the hospital, very ill. And some of the senior staff was still getting him to approve certain positions and policies and so on. He was amazing because he was very ill. And he was very concerned. Just days before he died, he was very concerned about the fact that the US had not ratified any. Personally wrote a letter to the Clintons. He wrote a personal letter saying how concerned he was that the US would stand out in such a way with countries that didn't even have a government, like Somalia, for example. So he said, what can you do about that? And then shortly thereafter, he passed away. And at his funeral service at St. John the Divine in New York City, Hillary Clinton, who was then First Lady, came, and she made a promise to have the US sign. So the US has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but is not yet ratified. And we can go into the legal technicalities of what that means, but essentially it means that there is an intention to ratify. And I think I will just stop there because I could speak about this for too long of a time. But thank you. I think that's just basic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, and it's really helpful and provides a lot of context and background. So thank you, Rebecca. So Michael, over to you. You're the head of UNICEF USA. So give us your perspective, the UNICEF perspective, when it comes to children's rights and yeah.
Yeah, and just a couple of things that Rebecca said. UNICEF has this very special role in the implementation of it as a technical expert to countries to help them be sure that they're living up to the commitments in the convention, which I think is great and we take very seriously. And we actually within the organization itself, within UNICEF itself, has been sort of a revival recently of this need to be an even bolder champion for child rights all around the world, and created a new office actually within UNICEF to really push this even further. Not specifically about the ratification here in the United States, and I will say this: in some sense, I feel responsible for that at this point because running UNICEF USA, we do a lot of advocacy and lobbying in Washington, and this would be one of our approaches. But now's not the time, and we're not going to get ratified now, and so we have sort of a long-term goal on that. But that's not the most important thing. Is the ratification. What is more important is that our federal, state, and local governments are aware of the rights of children and are building those things into their own policies. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later when I see moments of hope around some of these things. But I think in our country, children have a lot of rights. In fact, I pushed back on some of my staff when I first got here, talking about this issue and them saying, if the young people in our country understood that they were the only young people in the world that don't have rights because the convention isn't ratified here, they would, they'd be up in arms over it. And I said, well, let's be careful about that. Children do have rights here. There's a lot built into our federal law, state laws, local laws and policies that do give our children rights. And, you can look around the world at some of the countries that have ratified the convention and question whether some of them are living up to those parts of the convention that are important to children in their country. So I think the convention itself, while important, is not the big ticket item here. The big ticket item is an understanding of the rights of children and the promotion of those rights across secular and religious organizations and people and across our governments of various types. And we're a big country here in the United States. The federal government doesn't speak for everybody. It's really important to introduce these ideas and concepts there. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Jed, I noticed you were nodding as Michael was talking, and you spoke so beautifully about this idea of how rights flow from our Creator. So can you share your perspective, your experience? I mean, you've worn many hats. Also in your life journey. So we'd love to hear your perspective and through a Christian lens, if possible. You're muted, Jed.
You would think by now we would know about this mute thing, right? Yes. It's the convention. It is interesting in the sometimes conflicted relationships. I think that the Christians maybe, and particular certain branches of Christian faith, their feelings toward this convention, right? And I would argue that in many ways the convention actually flowed out of broadly the Abrahamic faiths and specifically out of the Christian consensus in the West. And there's plenty to discuss there and history and layers to that. But I think, if you look at ancient cultures, if you look at Greek, Roman, Babylonian, Aztec, Mayan, there was just not this assumption, and it grew steadily in the West. And so like the practice of exposing children that was common in Rome, the early Christians earned a reputation for going outside, finding these children outside the cities and taking them in and even raising them as their own children. And then you have the Emperor Justinian in the famous Code of Justinian banning the practice of exposing and requiring that children, even those who had no lineage or other protection, be treated with dignity and respect. And so I see the Convention on the Rights of the Child really flowing out of that. And yet there's also conflicted feelings that many in the Christian and other traditions have. And I think, just briefly, I've noted three elements that probably are areas of concern. One would just have to do with the idea of moving authority further away from the people that it affects. So the further you go away from local governance, the feeling is that if you have this global convention, it's further away from local families and decision making. And I think that can be an area of concern. A second category would just be a noting that many of the governments that have been the worst in the 20th century, totalitarian governments, whether in Germany, North Korea, China, communist Russia, virtually always went in between the relationship between parents and children. There was a formal legal part of that, an informal part of that. And so that people, I think, are wary of government stepping into that space, with historic basis for that hesitation. And then third, and maybe this is something we can talk about later, would be just there is a concern that the language of rights reduces the family relationship to more of a contract than a covenant. The language of rights is legal language, right? It's a legal framework and paradigm. And I think while we would say that, I think just about everyone would say there are certain rights and responsibilities, contractual obligations within a family, that it is so much more than that, right? There is a sense of human beings pledging their lives to one another, far beyond a business partnership where when I'm getting my needs met, I'm here, and if you're doing what I want you to do, I'm in the contract, but if you don't, I'm out. Like, we would believe that family is much more than that. And so there might be a concern that if we reduce family to a language of rights, we're missing out on some of the most important parts of family. So I think, there's plenty to discuss in each of those. And I think we can feel the weight of those and still say, hey, we really want to protect and stand for the rights of children. But I think those are just some of the hesitations that often come with people thinking about, a macro level convention.
Great. Thanks. And I love, Jed, your openness and openness in terms of sharing. So thank you for that. Rabbi Diana, tell us what are your thoughts? What are what are your thoughts? And if you can, also through a Jewish lens.
Well, now I'm really sitting and thinking Jed's points through, actually, and I'm actually.
And this is a beautiful thing, right? This is a conversation, so please feel free to respond to Jed.
I'm having this thought process in my mind because you did say covenant, and what is a covenant? A covenant, according to Jewish practice, is really that agreement, and in many ways we do call it a sacred contract between the divine and people, between us collectively, us as a smaller family unit. And I'm thinking about that while I'm holding in my lap, Rebecca, the book. So just so we know, I also have the book with me. And I was actually one of the contributors. So I'm sitting and I want to just point to one of the pages here, page 89 in the book, if anyone's looking. You could also find the book online. In Judaism, the family has been considered since biblical times to be the basic unit of the community and as the core foundation of Jewish life. This emphasis on family also means that parents have duties to provide care, meet health and nutrition needs, and to ensure education for their children. Parental duties and children's rights in the area of education include spiritual and moral guidance. And it continues on, but really wraps up very neatly and says, the requirements and obligations of parents are set forth in Jewish law, providing for children's physical, educational, and spiritual needs, and that children must be regarded with care, kindness, and tenderness. Childhood, according to the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Shabbat 152, describes childhood as a garland of roses. And I think about, what are the things that we put into law? Like, what are those things that we enshrine in the law? And I would hope that the things we enshrine in the law are the things that are so sacred to us as a community that we would want to safeguard and protect. And we look at children's rights, and while rights language is honestly a fairly, I would say, almost modern in the scope of human existence, is a modern notion. But the idea of actually having agreements, well, we see in Jewish life, the Torah is a contract. So the giving of Torah at Sinai 4,000 years ago is a contract. It's an agreement. We made that agreement. And in Jewish life in particular, the story goes at Mount Sinai, what happened? I'll tell you. So what happens at Mount Sinai is that God says, I've got this Torah, and I'm going to give it to somebody. I'm going to give it to a people. But what are you going to give me in return? And the Israelites are standing at the foot of the mountain. They go, hey, what are we going to give? And they say, we'll give you gold and silver. And God says, I made that. You don't need to give it to me. And they said, well, we'll give you the silks and all these fabrics that we have made. And God says, what use do I have with all of these man-made materials? And they went back and they thought and they thought and they thought, and they came back and said, God, we're going to teach it to our children. And God said, if the children are going to be the guardians of the Torah, I will give it to you. With that in mind, why wouldn't we in America, or boil it down further by state, by city, by town, by block, by building, why wouldn't we want to enshrine those rules, those laws to safeguard the people we protect most, that we love the most? Why wouldn't we want to enshrine them? I think that the CRC came through so much of the faith communities in our intentions. The meeting in Princeton, following the writing and the adoption, that understand that those faith leaders stood around and they saw it. And no one said, oh, this flies in the face of my religion. It flies in the face of my understanding of God, of the divine. What's gotten, I think, in the way is not about faith. It's about politics. And faith is often used and misused for political gain. It's just what it is. And religion can either be a resource or a roadblock. I would hope that more of us would choose to use our faith as a resource to enhance, improve, better our society for all people. So.
Thank you, Rabbi Diana. And I love this because now we're getting into conversation, right? Rabbi Diana responds to Jed. And now, Azza, over to you. What you can respond to what you've been hearing. You can share your own perspectives also through a Muslim lens. But yeah, take it where you wanted to go, Azza.
No, I think we need to ponder a bit the concerns that Jed raised in terms of what happens when you have to look at, ratifying a convention that seems to be taking the rights away from who should have it, so to speak, and, taking the oversight away from those who should own it, as one of the many points that were raised, and also the points that I think were very legitimately and very smartly raised by Rabbi Diana, which is the politicization of not faith, of religion and religious institutions. I think we should keep that distinction very, very clear in our minds. What we are living through now is a very strong era of politicization of religion. Or for some, it's called the religionization of politics. Really, take your pick. The point is that there's a very strong rapport between the religious institutions, some, and political institutions, some, not all, obviously, thankfully. But this very strong relationship, which is ultimately is to the benefit not so much of the citizens, but really it is to the benefit of specific political agendas, of specific political parties, of specific political interests, right? So what we would need to find in our midst, whether we come from majority Muslim, majority Christian, majority Jewish, whatever, majority Hindu societies, what we need to see is all religious leaders, or at least the majority of the religious institutions, coming together to act as the moral conscience of the political processes and the economic and financial processes. We need a moral consciousness that helps us keep the moral compass straight. What we don't need is an alliance that helps to further certain political interests, which in our current world are 99.9% based on fear. Different kinds of fear, fear of the other, fear of change, fear of this. The majority of the political discourses, whether we're looking at North or South, East or West, are based on fear-mongering. And our political discourses are making an art out of fear-mongering everywhere in the world, frankly. And I think that when that's the case, and there is an alliance with certain religious institutions, that can spell, and has historically spelled, trouble. And that's putting it very politely and diplomatically. It can spell the end of lives. Yes, and livelihoods, the end of our care and nurture for one another and for the nature that sustains us. So if we look at it, if we just go up a little bit and look at it from that perspective of being concerned about how the political and the religious are mixing in a rather toxic fashion, which is leading us away from international law. And international law is there to protect. It is not meant to distinguish or to prioritize or to marginalize. On the contrary, it is meant to protect the most vulnerable of all. So the idea that we would look at suspicion at international law, that is a reflection of our moral, political dynamics. It is not a reflection of our faith, and it is most certainly not a reflection of our faithfulness. And here's the issue. We need that moral consciousness in all faith traditions, of all faith traditions, rather than the political compasses that seem to be at most, 4 years, and then another 4 years if we're lucky, or if we're not lucky, depending. I think the issue here is to look at international laws as they are meant to be. They are meant to be the protective membrane for all of us, regardless, indeed, precisely because of our distinctions and our vulnerabilities. And in that case, it shouldn't be oh, gee, that CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is about taking, power away from some. No, actually, it's about protecting all at all times. And if we see it that way, then perhaps we can begin to distance ourselves from political agendas and the vested interests and look at the interests of all that are shared.
Thank you, Azza. So Michael, here you are, head of UNICEF USA. To put it mildly, in our country right now, there's a lot of acrimony, views, but how do you navigate those tensions in your role? How do you have those conversations? Can you maybe share with us, and please feel free to respond to the wonderful insights that we've heard from everyone right now, but what is your experience? Here you are in this very critical role, navigating a lot of tensions and spaces and discomfort. So maybe you can share a story around that, or just or respond to what you've been hearing, and yeah. So let's.
Yeah, wow. I so agree with the political dynamic that's been discussed here, and the politicization of religion, and I love the way you put that as not faith, but religion, and the problems that can cause. But one of the things we do at UNICEF USA is a lot of lobbying on Capitol Hill for both for funding for UNICEF, general foreign aid funding, policies and laws that are beneficial to children globally and here in the United States. And UNICEF has done just a tremendous job over the years of being very nonpartisan in doing that and finding a way to thread the needle through the middle to ensure that we have supporters on both sides of the aisle in Congress to try to move things forward that we want to move forward. So that causes us sometimes to hold our tongue a little more than we would want to in certain ways. That causes us to create alliances that might be unusual or in order to get certain things done. As it relates to issues around the rights of children and laws, legislation that impact children in that way, there are certain language that we won't use when we're talking to certain members of Congress and their staffs. On the other side, there are certain people we know who would love to be champions of the Convention on the Rights, and we'd rather they kind of not be because of the politicization of all of that and who carries what water forward sort of matters. So we've learned the art of how to speak about these things in a way that you need to know your audience. I take some lessons actually from another not-for-profit organization that's focused on campaign finance reform, and they realized they couldn't get anything done in Washington talking about campaign finance reform. So they did a lot of studies to say, what is the language that we could use to actually move some things forward? And let's start at the local and state level first, where you can maybe get some more things done. So they crafted different language around corruption and some other ideas that seem to draw people from both sides of the political spectrum around these ideas rather than around something that can be as divisive, especially in Washington, as campaign finance reform. And I think we have to do something similar to that here. We need to not feel like we're purists that always have to talk about rights, because sometimes it's not the right language to get the same things. And even when we talk about it, right to what? Sort of the general concept of rights, I keep saying, what? Right to what? The convention is clear on all kinds of things that none of us have argued that children should have access to. We talk about every child being healthy, educated, protected, and respected. And so those are the rights that we're actually advocating for. And when you frame them in certain ways, I think you can get more accomplished than if you stick to contractual language or legal language or language that may play well elsewhere in the world, but not necessarily to all the constituents here. So more work, I think, still needs to be done on that. How do we frame this in a way that religious communities and political communities can gather around it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Michael. And you share with us, right, how do we thread that needle? How do we work within those spaces? Where do we find that common ground and the common awareness and understanding focus in terms of where we want to get to and what's important for children concretely in a tangible, real way, day-to-day lives for children and families? Rebecca, so you're now, you worked for UNICEF for many years. You're with Arigato. You're also a recent abuela, grandmother. So, you speak, what's your, and I want to hear from you specifically these questions that we should not be purists, right? Or even responding to Michael, responding to Jed, to Asa, to Rabbi Diana, but just hear from you, your own experiences where you are. You spoke with so much passion earlier when you talked about Hillary Clinton showing up there and the Clintons and James Grant, who was an icon within the world for children for so long. And in his deathbed, he's like, why can't we do this? Why can't we do this? Right? He's dying, and that's his dying wish, right? And so I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, and maybe share the tensions that you've experienced. But really take it from, just respond in the way you want to respond.
Stephen, how many minutes do I have?
You have
there's a lot there
2
to
minutes
say.
and 59 seconds, Rebecca.
Well, first of all, I agree with what you all have said in so many ways, but when you have a contract, it's much more powerful than when you just have an oral agreement in any area, that we can talk about. So for lawyers and for human rights advocates, the CRC is much more powerful. And let me tell you, in the 90s, when UNICEF headquarters realized it had to assume a big responsibility in promoting the CRC, back in the 90s, at headquarters of UNICEF, we were having huge screaming fights. This is at a senior level. And we were discussing why we had to do a paradigm shift from needs to rights. And it was difficult. And a lot of the senior staff that had been there for years and years would say to me, but Rebecca, why are we going to suddenly talk about rights? Is this because we have to talk to lawyers now instead of health and education ministers? I mean, what are you talking about? Me being one of the many people at headquarters that was advocating for a rights approach. Okay, so having said that, there was a shift, a paradigm shift, and we all agreed that this made UNICEF have to address issues beyond health and education. And this is how UNICEF suddenly had to address child labor, child protection became a big area of concern. Before that, it was just primarily looking at infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, water and sanitation. I mean, we were very limited in scope, and suddenly we were looking at child labor, we were looking at trafficking of children, we were looking at all these issues that UNICEF at that point in time did not feel comfortable with, and it had to step up and develop a capacity for all of these areas. Now it's considered normal. Having said that, language is very important. And I understand, Michael, when you're talking about in your job, I understand it perfectly why you would be very careful in the language that you use. We do the same. We know that faith communities, and this is wearing my new hat at Arigato International, we work through an interfaith approach. We bring to the table, we convene all the different religious and faith representatives. We organize big powwows in different parts of the world and tackle tough issues like ending violence against children, all its forms. You would think, how could that be a tough issue? It's very tough. It's a very tough issue when you're dealing with child marriage, when you're dealing with female genital mutilation, when you're dealing with the trafficking of children online and online abuse, and the list goes on. So how do we reach out to faith communities? How do we reach out to the faith leaders that don't know what we're talking about when we're talking about the CRC, which is a legal document? But if anybody would take the time to read it, you would see, if you read it, I mean, and I'm not talking about this group, I'm sure everybody here has read every single piece of that treaty. But in the public in general doesn't know what it's talking about. And if you did a comparative analysis, which countries are supposed to do when they ratify, they're supposed to do a comparative analysis and then say, okay, this is where we need to improve the situation. You would see that the US is doing very well, and then it could easily ratify, but there's been misinformation, it's been politicized, as we have mentioned, and then people have given up. I really do not understand, Stephen, and all of you, how, it did not happen during Obama's administration with Hillary Clinton there. How did this not get through? And let me just, I could say a lot more about this, but a lot of it is just in the misinformation, in the politicization, and the fact that people do not know the principles and standards of the most widely ratified international human rights treaty. They don't know the content. Lastly, and I'm getting off subject because you're looking at me like it's time to go. Let's just leave it for the next thing. But why Hillary Clinton and Obama did not push this through when, this is what I wanted to say, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has been ratified, all right, in 1992. So the US is part of that body of human rights laws. It has committed to reporting on how it implements the civil and political rights of all Americans. So having said that, why hasn't the CRC been ratified? Question mark. It's about children. Why hasn't CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, I think there are only 3 countries in the world at this point, right? Asa, you should know this because of your background. But there are virtually very few countries that have not ratified that either. And also, United States has ratified the optional protocol on the sale and trafficking of children, and also on children's participation in conflict. So those 2 are optional protocols that are part of the CRC have been ratified. Just putting that on the table.
Thank you, Rebecca, and your passion, right? This is what it's all about. Jed, you started us up, dude. Like we were like, this is what's wonderful about this conversation, right? You spoke, hey, you shared your thoughts, you've heard responses. There's some warm, maybe a little hot type of responses responding to you, which is what it's all about. And this is so wonderful, right? And so let's, hear from you. Rebecca shares, well, when we have a contract, it's more powerful than an oral agreement. Before we had the convention, we were just doing health stuff. I imagine you would say, well, there was no convention or when Jesus was around, and he was very much focused on protecting children in different ways, not just. So I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, your responses, where you've experienced tension, and also if you can bring in your government experience. You were, for George W. Bush, you were at the White House, you were the head of faith-based initiatives. And so just take it from here. You've led us to a really wonderful conversation, a really back and forth. And so, yeah, let's hear from you and those tensions that you've been sensing and hearing amongst ourselves, which is really, really healthy and good.
Yeah, absolutely. I do love this. And I just want to be clear. I do not want to be the resident skeptic of the idea of children having intrinsic fundamental rights, because I believe that with all my heart. I think what I want to introduce to the conversation and for us to grapple with is the incompleteness of rights language to capture the fullness of what family at its best is. That would be my feeling, right? My conviction. I think of, for instance, even my grandmother and my grandfather, and marriage would be. I'd see that through the same lens. And yes, they each had certain rights in American law as a husband and a wife, and there was a legal aspect to their union that could have been dealt with in various courts in various ways. But then you move into the level of day-to-day life, of love, of sacrifice, and of seeing my grandfather as he had Alzheimer's, and he lost his wonderful capacities formerly as a doctor, now unable to remember people's names, and my grandmother faithfully loving him day by day to the very end. And no amount of legislation, no amount of rights language could ever have prescribed that. It was based in a sacred covenant and a deep sense of commitment before God. And so again, I'm not dismissing the language of rights, but I think it's a very baseline type of provision in my view, whereas family and marriage and many of the most important things in life can never be reduced to that. And there is a danger sometimes when we try, and again, this is not to say we shouldn't use that language, but we just need to be wary of a danger towards the atomization of individuals, meaning we come to see ourselves all as completely independent, individualized actors who come together solely for our mutual benefit. And rather than that we have certain deeper moral obligations that cannot be prescribed by law. And so that is just what I want to urge, even as we're grappling with wonderful things. I think, just a word on the tensions here. I do believe that, at the heart of this is this very good actual tension between two beautiful and competing goods. One is the rights and protections and thriving of children on the one hand, and at this very same time in ensuring a family integrity and the wholeness of families and holding those things together. And sometimes they seem to be opposite. Sometimes in our public policy discussions, we'll pit them against each other. I see that a lot in my work with the U.S. foster system. There's a very real tension at times between the work of child protection of children who may have faced abuse or severe neglect and the preservation and restoration of families. And sometimes tribes form around one of those or the other. And while I think there is a tension there, I really do believe that thoughtfulness and wisdom continually pulls us back to a gripping of two things that seem to be in tension, or maybe even seem to be opposite, you know. And I think the best of, in my view, thinking about Christian theology, the best of Christian theology really is continually about holding seeming tensions between this idea of God's justice and his mercy, the idea that Jesus came full of grace and full of truth, or the idea that we're to be very confident as individuals, but also very humble. And I think each person on this Zoom here could probably lay forward other seeming opposites that we need to hold together. And when it comes to, you know, some of this discussion, we're talking about the rights, protections of children, meanwhile, also the family integrity, and recognizing that there is so much more than rights language alone. And we can hopefully hold those things side by side.
Hey, Rabbi Diana, I sense you want to respond. You know, share with us, and you can go in terms of responding to what you're hearing, and you shared with us, you know, from the Jewish perspective, in terms of this concept of the children as guardian of the Torah, you know, enshrining in terms of the covenant, you know, so take it, you know, share with us, either responding to what you've heard from others, to where we are now, or even or maybe sharing your own, the tensions that you experience. I mean, you play a very critical role where you also, you know, navigating a lot of those worlds and tensions. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm listening to the conversation, and I'm pulled in a lot of different directions. So I'm going to try and pick up a couple of different things that I've heard, because one, I'm a rabbi. So a rabbi means teacher. That's literally what it means. And rabbis are a fairly modern Jewish invention. We've only been rabbiing for about 2,000 years in this grand scheme of things. And to understand, I am a female rabbi. I'm looking forward to the day I don't have to qualify that I'm a female rabbi, which means I'm a progressive rabbi, because I work for an organization of about 800 rabbis. And they're about equal parts Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Ashkenazi, Sephardi. So you can imagine, you know, one rabbi, 3 opinions, 800 rabbis, well, we're overwhelmed. But I'm thinking about this tension around child rights, because I think when in America, we have this notion of what we want our children to have, right? What is the American dream? That our children should have a better life than we have. Our children have a better life than the generation before them. Most of us are here. We are a nation of immigrants. We've all come from somewhere, and we have a story of being the stranger, and then the story of welcoming the stranger. And when we talk about our children having this better life, it's having the access to education, it's the access to opportunity, it's access to healthcare, it's access to living in safety, and living in a space of religious freedom of expression, right? To be able to say, to believe, to practice. We see what's going on in the world today, and I am bereft. You know, that moment in the morning when you wake up and you're not quite sure where you are, but you take that first breath, and you almost don't remember what the trauma that is happening in the world. And then reality hits, and you carry all of that weight. You feel it on you. And, you know, Jewish teaching is we're supposed to welcome the stranger. We're supposed to do all of these things. We're supposed to make sure our children have an education. We're supposed to give them access to healthcare, all children, not just my child, but your child. Jewish life doesn't have a differentiation between a Jewish child and a non-Jewish child. You know, the person who lives here or the stranger, we are welcoming. We treat them all the same. And we understand that all of our religious teachings are teachings. It's how do we live them? How do we actually live them day in and day out? How do we, you know, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, of where our beliefs are actually in our practice. And Rebecca, you were talking a moment ago about, you know, how UNICEF's mandate kind of changed with CRC, right? This transformation that happened. And I was thinking about, in the United States, we know that marriage is not at a uniform age. This is a states' rights issue, kind of like what age are you when you drive a car? Right? When you get your license, you get it at 15, 16. I could drive a tractor at 12. Different differentiations. But the first state in the country to actually make marriage without any exclusions, the age of 18, anybody remember, was New Jersey. Nope, sorry, I scratched that. It was Delaware. Why? It was supposed to be New Jersey. And the governor at the time, Chris Christie, got the bill. It passed through Trenton, no problem, gets to his desk, and he vetoes the bill. And he said it puts an undue burden on religious communities. And to think what happened the next day. The faith communities all showed up in Trenton. And I don't know if you've ever been to Trenton, it's not so nice this time of year. They all descend on Trenton and they all walk in and how dare you veto this bill in our name? We believe that children have an inherent right to childhood. There is no religious belief that requires marriage before the age of 18. There's no requirement. So Delaware became the first state and New Jersey became the second state. Today we have 12 states. 12 states where marriage is illegal before the age of 18 without exception. And this is, I think, the tension. What do our political actors think about children's rights? How do they believe that they interact with us? How do they think they're safeguarding religious practice, people of faith? And where does this all fit together? And it means we need more conversations. Religious communities need to stand up in a unified way, not me over here and you over there and this one over there, but we have to sit. You know, here in the city of New York, we have the Commission of Religious Leaders of the City of New York. And it's co-chaired by His Eminence Timothy Cardinal Dolan and by Rabbi Joe Potasnik and Reverend Dr. A.R. Bernard. And we have people of all faiths sitting around that table, senior leaders in their communities, within the 5 boroughs, talking about the issues of the day. And if we think about the world, and if we try and make the world, our communities safe for children, if we make the world safe for children, we will make the world safe for all.
Can you hear me now? There we go. The voice is back. Aza, Rabbi Diana, I'm bereft. The trauma going on in the world. How do we live our values day in and day out? What you can respond to that. You can share where you are. You can share with where you are right now in this moment and the tension that you experience, and also responding to what we've heard from others.
Rabbi Diana, you're the rabbi, you're the religious leader, so you need to go first.
No, I'm asking you, Aza, because we didn't hear from you about the tensions.
Well, if you put me vis-a-vis a religious leader, I will always defer to the religious leader. That's just the way things are. But okay, I got it. Thank you, Stephen. I think it's important perhaps I raise it as a question, even though it is my conviction. Is it always necessary to look at it as a zero-sum game? Is it either the family or the child or the children? Is it either Palestine or Israel? Is it either the United States or China? Must we always look at it as either this or that when we all know, and we've just come out of a pandemic that has taught us this question among so many things, that truly our survival depends on one another's welfare, that I am only as strong as the weakest amongst us, and that frankly, every nation is only as strong as the members of its community together, not individualized. So I totally hear and I agree that this is what we see, that there's indeed a tension between, the rights of the family and the family's own welfare. But is it always either or? And can we perhaps begin to change that particular paradigm amongst ourselves. And it's one of the things that all faiths, including indigenous faith traditions, force us to actually ask and to do. What is it that is in the interest of the whole, the common good? We have used that either or paradigm to effectively burn our planet up. We have no water left that will cover the members of our population of this planet. We have oxygen that is tainted, and we have done such harm to the planet without which we would not exist. Right? Of course, some of us can go to Mars and Venus and all that. Some of us come from there anyway. But the point is, we need this planet big time for our common existence. Is it that we must extract now in order to do this? Either or is it that in order for us to survive as children, as adults, as different genders, as different races, is it perhaps that we must think of the welfare and the interconnectedness of our welfare? Is it possible that a family will be fine when the children are being deeply and egregiously harmed? What community is good that way? What community survives that way? Which Palestinian family is going to be okay tomorrow, given what has happened to its children and its women and its men? So I think we have to push ourselves a little bit, especially those of us inspired by the fact that we understand there's a creator who created all of us and this planet, and who actually expects us to look after one another. That's the basic contract that we have with one another and this earth, and we have to look after one another. There is no sense in assuming that if one entity or individual is going to be fine, then everything else is going to be fine or is going to be in harm. No, there is an interdependence. Healthy children, healthy families, healthy communities, healthy nations, they go together, and there is no one nation that will be fine if the other one next to it is burning. Doesn't work that way, ever. So how can we challenge ourselves to help even our faith leaders who supposedly know it all? How can we help our faith leaders and work with them to understand that we are completely, absolutely, in every way, super dependent on one another's welfare, and where there is a wound, there is harm to the body.
So powerful, Azza. And so let me, I'm looking, we have some great questions that are being asked from audience members. Let me maybe start with you, Rebecca. One of the audience members asks, rights are important, but the key issue is leadership, power, authority. You can have whatever you want on the books about this is your right, this is your legal right. But whoever has power and leadership is the one who sees that rights are protected, can make choices. What's your answer to that? You can be a country, let's say a country that's ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and you have a government what power do you have over them? In what way does that make it, what are your thoughts about that question?
That's a big question. We're living in interesting times, I think. And absolutely, it's an imperative that we have good leaders, and we don't have good leaders right now, I'm sorry to say. And let's face it, the world is in a terrible state of it's a big void, in my opinion. And we are changing so many things around the world. There's so many wars, there's so much conflict. The poor children, as I look at my newly born grandson the other day, as I looked at him, a few days old, and I thought, what kind of future is he going to see? There are so many things that are not, we're not able to fix right now. We're not able to fix the problems that countries are having with immigration and refugees, an unprecedented number of children having to flee their homes from forced displacement. What a mess. We're going back on things where we were making progress. To give you one example, The Gambia right now is about to reinstate the possibility of legal FGM, of female genital mutilation. We fought hard for banning that practice. And if you look at Egypt, 97% of females at one point, Aza, 97% of the Egyptian women were undergoing FGM. And this was in the 90s when I went to Cairo with the CRC committee and the CEDAW committee to see what could be done about many things. But that was one of the issues that we addressed. And Aza, maybe you have a more updated information on that. But my point is that we are in a mess. We don't have the leaders that we need to provide us with a better world. This country, the United States, which has been a champion in the world for democracy, now is also trying to defend its position as world leader. It's having to defend its position as a democratic nation. A lot of countries around the world are questioning the leadership of the United States. So before I get into preaching things that you already know, I would say that I think what's hopeful is what we're doing at Arigato International, even though it's a drop in the bucket. And that is that we have interfaith dialogue. We are bringing together different people to look at these issues from a multi-religious perspective. And that is because, as Gandhi well put it, if you want to promote peace in the world, you have to start with children. And so we're working with children. And one of the things that we do every year that's very hopeful is that we commemorate the World Day of Prayer and Action for Children on November 20th. We bring together representatives of religious communities and faith communities from different parts of the world. We bring them all together to worship, all for children. Children are very, very much a part of our discourse. And I just want to leave you with this one more note, in that is we have to ensure that children's participation and their voices are heard. Mm-hmm. And that is something that should sound like a very acceptable point and principle, but it's very, very controversial. The idea that children have a voice and participate, as you know, Stephen, as you know, Diana, is as a hot potato. So we're talking with faith communities to see how we can improve that. And in everything that we do, we engage the voices and participation of children. So I think that they might change. Bottom line, the children may be able to change the situation that our question was all about, the lack of leadership.
Right. Thank you, Rebecca. And what I will ask is at the end of it, just before we finish, I'll ask each of you to go around what's something that gives you that hope. But I want to be, we have some great questions. Jed, so on the one hand, I ask Rebecca, right? You can have, it's about power, right? You can have whatever you have on the books about rights, but if it's not enforced, it's not enforced. You shared that beautiful story about your grandparents, right? The incompleteness of a law, right? The love that's based on the sacred covenant, the way that cannot be reduced. This, you cannot atomize individuals. That feeling, that visceral, connected, intersubjective experience of your grandparents is something that can never be codified, right? One of our members asks, what if the adults of the family don't protect children? What if you have a family that may have certain religious values and they abuse their child? Or, here's a question. I mean, Rabbi Diana, she's throwing in those like, hey, we have like 38 states that allow a child to be married, legally to be married. And most of it is connected to religious traditions that say I can choose as a parent to marry my 10-year-old, my 12-year-old child. How do you respond to, to that question around like, okay, so, but shouldn't there be a baseline? Shouldn't be a baseline regardless? Because right now we do live in a in this beautiful concoction of a tapestry of religions and faiths and ways of engaging with each other in this country that is the United States. So how would you answer to someone that with that specific question, Jed?
Yeah, I would say yes, we do need baseline for sure. We need baseline protections based on a consensus of our culture. And dare I say it, that is in a certain sense a legislation of morality, right? We so often say you can't legislate morality, but we are talking about a moral vision that's saying fundamentally that the law of the survival of the fittest is actually not our vision, that we really believe that every human being is of immense and intrinsic value, and that we as a society, while we also believe very much in the sacredness of the family and its unique role, there are certain baselines of protection from serious forms of severe neglect and abuse, where we would say, something that meets that criterion. We do believe in the child protection system, and there are of course real tensions in that, right? And making those decisions, the social workers and judges who have to make those decisions every day in our culture, those are some of the hardest decisions that I could imagine. It's never going to be simple and straightforward, but I do think, as Michael alluded to, even though the U.S. has not ratified the CRC, we do have some of the strongest child protection systems in the world, despite its real flaws and many critiques I would give. And so that's a vital part of our culture that I believe is flowing out of a vision that says there is a moral order to the universe, and that we, both as individuals, as families, and as a society, want to live that out together.
Thank you, Jed. So, Michael, how would you respond to that question about whoever's in power gets to decide what it means to protect children? How do you respond to about the legislation of morality? How do you respond to, we have someone who says, what happens when local authority is co-opted, right? We go back to Jed. Jed said the closest, families should be able to make their own decisions. The closest you are to there, they should make decisions. However, even when local governments have certain protections for that, you can have a state government that says, you know what, I'm going to get in the business of your family. It could be about a lot of different issues that we're very familiar in the United States. So what are your thoughts about this example?
Yeah, no, thank you. Just go back to my early reference at the very start out of the Christian tradition of Jesus actually calling the young people to him. And just playing a little bit off of Rebecca's comment about youth participation. So one of the things that I think is particularly exciting is the opportunities that youth are being given in various places to serve on boards, to serve in government in various ways. We brought in 2020 the Child Friendly Cities Initiative, which is a global UNICEF program, here to the United States, and we're working with a number of municipalities around the country who are moving in a process toward becoming a officially sanctioned child-friendly city by UNICEF. I was in Minneapolis not too long ago, where they moved along this path a bit. And not only have they established youth councils to gather youth input into their own policy making, but they've placed youth on municipal boards there to make sure that youth are being heard. So who makes the policy? Who makes the law? Those who are sitting around such tables. And the more that we can have youth participating in that, respecting their voice, respecting their participation, remembering that they do have something important to say that we need to listen to, that they're not just the subjects of our work, but they are partners with us and participants in all of this, the better we will all be. So just a real call for youth engagement and youth participation. I took on a youth mentor recently, actually 3 of them, who are mentoring me to make sure that I am getting that viewpoint into my own thinking. And I just think that's really critical.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Rabbi Diana, someone asks, how do you as a religious leader call out those who have hijacked religion? You can, however you want to respond to that question. I think share your own experiences.
Religion can be used and misused. There's a lot of myth and misinformation about faith and religious teachings. And it's up to leaders, and I use that term very broadly because I don't think you need to be a member of the clergy to be a leader in your community. And I think it's very, very important to go to the point that Michael just made about youth and child participation. Children need to be at the table. They need to be part of the conversation. Once upon a time, we had a rule here at the board that says we couldn't have any manels. There couldn't be a panel discussion with only men. You had to make sure that there were women on the panel. So no manels. And now when I think about the work we're doing with the Global Network of Religions for Children, with Arigato International, is thinking about how we make sure that we have youth representations. We now have a youth representative from the New York Board of Rabbis for the UN. Somebody, a young person, 24 years old, who now represents us there. We need to make sure that young people are part of the conversation, and we have to make sure that there's room for more and more points of view. And not every action a person takes when they are Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Sikh or Zoroastrian or of any faith, not every action they take is of their faith. Not everything is abiding by those rules and those laws. Not every act is in keeping with our traditions. We need to aspire. We need to have intentionality in how we live our lives. Many people I meet, they were born of a certain faith, and they say, I'm not practicing. I said, well, actually, I think we're all just practicing all the time. We're trying to get better at something like you would an instrument. But the idea is that faith is not something we just take out on holidays. It's not something, it's not, we set the table. It's like, oh, it's time for dinner. And tonight we're going to have, we're going to have X holiday. The Jewish community just came through Passover. The Muslim community just came through Ramadan. Our Christian friends all just came through 2 different times of Easter, Orthodox Easter and Catholic Easter. The idea being is that we need to be more engaged in all this so that we take back the power, so that we are more knowledgeable about our faith. Can't do it any other way.
Thank you, Rabbi Diana. And let's just go round very briefly as we're finishing our conversation today, which is not the end of a conversation, but hopefully the continuation of conversations in all the various different spaces. Aza, what within the world that we inhabit, within what you shared so powerfully, so viscerally, what gives you hope? Where do you experience, where have you experienced maybe recently hope? Yeah.
When I served at Religions for Peace, I set up the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund. I was shocked that there wasn't such a thing already, quite frankly, because we're all doing humanitarian. We know humanitarian is our future, unfortunately. But the multi-religious collaboration to put our monies where our mouths are and do things together, the version that we see, for instance, in the Arigato work, that isn't there for the humanitarian work. And I think what gave me the most amount of hope was to see how 75% of the proposals that came in from around the world came in from young people, came in from women who had already, because that was one of the criteria, who have already been working multi-religiously together with their community, with other civil rights and society actors. And they were asking for more support because usually you go to the Catholic, you go to the Jewish, you go to the Muslim, but they were like, hey, this is for us to keep working together. Yes, great. It was women, and it was young women in particular who submitted the most amounts, because based on what they were already doing, that they were wanting to support. That gave me so much hope. And I realized that if we're going to learn, we're actually going to learn from our children and our younger adults. That's where we're going to learn from. And it isn't because they hold the keys to the future. Only, frankly, they hold the keys to the present. They are the now, and they need to be honored. And the way to honor them is, yes, to make sure that they're safe, they're protected, but also to listen to their voices, as I think I heard many of you say, and to realize that we're not going to need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to be better listeners. And it isn't all in the hands of religious leaders or religious institutions. In fact, thank you, Rabbi Diana, we need to reclaim our faith as ordinary beings who are serving and committed to the service of all. That reclaiming of our faith isn't about violence. It's exactly the opposite. It's about understanding that the Creator needs to be loved and appreciated and recognized, and that when we serve one another, we recognize and love and appreciate the Creator. It is as simple as that, and it is incredibly necessary as that.
Thank you so much, Aza. Jed, 3 words. What gives you hope?
Yeah. Well, I do feel the brokenness of our world keenly, like Rabbi Gerson mentioned, and I think we all do in this realm of work. And yet, at the very same time, I do see such beauty, especially in ordinary people, ordinary families, local faith communities, that are specifically welcoming in children, welcoming in struggling families, taking in children and welcoming them as a permanent member of their family through adoption, caring temporarily through foster care, amidst the pain and mess of that and struggles, caring for biological families that have come apart and helping them come back together and walking with them through addiction or other things with the hope of restoring that family. And not just on a macro or theoretical level, but in the day-to-day sacrifice of life. It is, as I see that, I just see such beauty. And indeed, that gives me joy, gives me hope.
Michael, very, very quickly, we're past time. What gives you hope?
Yeah, I think we do a lot of interfaith work with partners from a variety of religions, and every time that I am engaged in that interfaith work, I just get a sense that there is a path here to creating a better world with the commonalities that we have, and when we focus on them. So, yeah, it's that interfaith work that really inspires and excites me.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca. Last word. What gives you hope?
Same as Michael's. The interfaith work that I'm doing is so exciting. It's so meaningful and inspirational that gives me a lot of hope. And we're going to be meeting in Abu Dhabi in November. We're going to be addressing a number of pressing child rights issues. And it's going to be a big gathering with faith leaders from all over the world and with the human rights advocates. That kind of synergy is what we're looking for. And I think that's inspirational.
Deeply grateful to the 5 of you and for everyone joining us today and who will also have access to the recording. Special gratitude to the Culture of Encounter Project, again, a joint initiative of the Berkeley Center on Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and the Collaborative on Global Children's Issues at Georgetown University that makes this possible. Thank you, everyone. And
Stephen,
gratitude. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a good day.
This was excellent. Thank you all. Great to see everyone.